Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of GeoPod. I'm your host Dylan Woods, and in today's video I want to expose the grand schemes of the Ayatollah regime and kind of give you a little bit of information about what the Ayatollah regime constitutes, or rather the threat it constitutes for Western civilization and to, of course, the regional stability within the Middle East. So the Ayatollahs are religious hardliners, religious leaders who adhere to the Shia doctrine of Islam. And their ultimate aim is to expand their Shia doctrine as far out as possible, right? So the first step in that is transforming the Middle East into a dominantly Shia region. So as of right now, the Sunni doctrine of Islam is most predominantly practiced among Muslims, also within the Middle East. So before the Ayatollah regime wishes to expand its influence beyond the Middle East, although they have various ways of doing that, and I will delve into those a little bit deeper shortly. They first aim to subjugate the Middle East to their religious whim, let's say. Well, how do they wish to do that, where the region is predominantly Sunni, and seems, at least many countries within it, seem to drift more towards the Western world and to increase their relationships with them? Well, similarly to what they did in their own countries, is they wish to infiltrate their societies, infiltrate educational institutions all across the region, infiltrate religious institutions by creating religious clergies, with the aim of eventually infiltrating political factions as to institutionalize the Shia doctrine within as many nations within the region as possible. A very good example of this going on right now is in Iraq, right, where you have the democratic factions who wish to turn Iraq into a prosperous democracy, and on the other hand we have Shia hardliners who wish to turn it into a Shia government, thereby making it a part of Iran's proxy network within the region. So the Ayatollahs want to spread the influence of their Shia narrative, their Shia doctrine of Islam, in order to solidify themselves as the most dominant power within the Middle East. However, there's another power opposing them, which is Israel, the Jewish state of Israel, which acts as the sole democracy within the region and as the sole Jewish political presence within the region. So this brings us to the other objective that the Ayatollah regime adheres to, which is the inevitable or potential or eventual eradication of the Jewish state of Israel. So then one might ask, well, how do they wish to bring that about? Well, that's where Iran's proxy network comes into play. So over the past couple of decades, Iran has organized, supported, funded, reinforced, and developed countless proxy militias within the Middle East. Shia militias who act as their enforcers and act as protectors of the Ayatollah regime. So pretty much like NATO, the Ayatollahs have sought to institutionalize an alliance consisting of multiple militias in order to project deterrence and in order to project military might. So eventually, what they wish to accomplish with this proxy network is grow it strong enough so that it may actively oppose Israel, eventually eradicating it in its entirety, alongside with their nuclear program, which eventually has to allow them the nuclear weapons capability, so that they can disseminate a nuclear or multiple nuclear warheads to one or multiple of their proxies, which can then be used against the Jewish state. That's their goal with their proxy network. That's their goal with their nuclear program. It's to eradicate Israel and thereby, or in conjunction with that, eradicate Western interests, Western assets and Western presence from the region. So they wish to cast the United States out, projecting a deterrent so that they may never return again, their nuclear program being one of the biggest steps in that endeavor, and at the same time eradicate the Jewish state of Israel and return Palestine to the Muslims, or rather the Ayatollah regime or any Shia proxy that will at that point assume control within those territories. So then one might say, well, once they've achieved that, they'll stop, right? Like, it's enough for them. They have got what they wanted. Well, not exactly, and that brings us to their end game. So any radical Islamic entity has had, ever since radical Islam first came into prominence, has had one similar end objective, which is the global institutionalization of Islam, the overthrow of Western civilization to be replaced by Sharia law and to be governed by Islamists. This was the end goal, is the end goal of the Muslim Brotherhood. This was the end goal of Al-Qaeda. This is the end goal of ISIS. And this is the end goal of the Ayatollah regime within Iran. So then one might ask, well, how do they wish to bring this about? I mean, the United States stands as the strongest military power the world has ever known. NATO stands stronger than it's ever had. I mean, how can they probably seek to challenge that power? Well, again, we have to return to the practices of the Muslim Brotherhood back in the 1950s and the 1960s. So they created a blueprint of how to alter Western civilization over time. And this started by sending agents in the form of students, in the form of immigrants, to Western nations, whose purpose was then to multiply and to infiltrate educational systems, educational societies, political factions, organizations, businesses, as to steadily spread the influence of Islam. So when we take a look at Western civilization right now, what do we see? Well, many countries, especially in Europe, have a huge Muslim demographic, which has been growing ever since the first Muslim immigrants arrived back in the 20th century. Muslims, according to their demographics, tend to multiply faster than many European citizens within those countries. So what we're faced with now is an ever-growing Muslim population that, as it seems, will one day become the majority in many of those European countries, thereby allowing numbers to stand on the side of those who have orchestrated such schemes in the first place. Secondary, what they wish to do, what the Muslim Brotherhood wish to do, what the Ayatollah regime in Iran now wishes to do, is spread the narrative within Western society with the aim to alter public perception regarding Islam. So they understand that as of right now, the West has a certain set of values and morals. They also see a lot of vulnerabilities and weaknesses associated with that. Weaknesses they think they can exploit. Weaknesses they think they can manipulate. So activism, for example, has become a very strong tool for hardliners, and Iran is particularly, to expand their narrative, to alter public perception, and to use that sensationalism as to pull more people to their cause, even though such people might not even know who they're actively supporting. So, by spreading the narrative over an extended period of time, gradually infiltrating every layer of Western society, they believe that potentially, with patience, they at one point might have enough momentum to overthrow Western civilization from the inside out and swiftly replace it with an Islamic civilization and Sharia law. That's the end game. That was the end game of the Muslim Brotherhood. It was the end game of Al-Qaeda, the end game of ISIS, and the end game of the Ayatollah regime in Iran. So knowing this, what can we in the Western world do to combat that? How can we stop that? How can we prevent this from happening? Well, first and foremost, acknowledging the fact that we're faced with this given threat. We have to acknowledge the fact that we're faced with an adversary that seeks our destruction, that doesn't just seek to increase its own influence, but seeks the very annihilation of Western civilization, seeks to erase us from the histories, and install a radical regime instead of that. Totalitarian by nature, oppressive. So first of all, we have to acknowledge that this threat poses against us. We have to acknowledge that this threat exists. And as of right now, we're not even acknowledging it. Politicians within the Western world still perceive Iran as this problem child one that needs to be tended to, one that needs to be conversed with, one that needs to be bargained with, one that will eventually listen to reason. Well, that's idiocracy at its finest. It's blind, it's dangerously blind to think that. The Ayatollahs and pretty much any other radical hardliners don't perceive the world as we do. They don't share our common values, they don't share our common ethics, they don't share our common viewpoints. The only thing that exists is their religious righteousness, which in their eyes allows them to transcend law in the name of their faith. And that's something that the Western world fails to understand. For us in the Western world, law stands at the highest virtue, the highest mechanism of order. For them, it's not law, it's religion, or rather their interpretation of their religion. They don't care about our laws. They would cast our laws aside at the very first moment once they believe that it no longer serves the interest of their religion, the interest of their faith, or rather their specific narrative of their faith. And that's something that we in the Western world still fail to understand, and that's why we still have not succeeded as much as we could have succeeded in preventing and mitigating terrorism and radicalization. It's evil, and evil can be bargained with. Evil needs to be mitigated. It needs to be halted. It needs to be confined. It needs to be stopped. Secondly, what we can do in the West in order to combat this is understand where the problem arises from. What are the methodologies that agents such as or factions rather, such as the Ayatollah regime and the Muslim Brotherhood and Al-Qaeda before it, what are the methodologies they adhere to bring about this end game, this end goal, this end objective of overthrowing Western civilization? Well, migration is one of them. Okay, so we have to check migration. We have to exert more control over migration. We need to measure it more properly. We need to check it better. We need to create sharper conditions accompanied with it. Like we can't just adhere to open borders anymore when it comes to our southern nations within Europe. We need to reinforce our security posture. We need to rethink our policies. We need to sharpen them. I'm not saying I'm against immigration. I'm just saying we need to sharpen them, and we need to separate and differentiate between those who enter our borders. So that's one thing that we can do. Thirdly, what we can do is become less tolerant regarding those radical voices that are currently spreading within our own communities. They have been allowed free rein with the Palestinian protests. They have been allowed free rein within our political factions for far too long, all under the guise of democracy and freedom of speech. We should have a harder stance against that. We have to pose a harder front, a firmer front against radical voices, whose only purpose is to indoctrinate, to misinform, and rally other unfortunate souls to their cause. That's the goal of the Ayatollah regime, that's the goal of the radical Islamists active within the world. It's to alter perception, sway the masses, or those susceptible to their message, to their cause, eventually having a big enough following to actively overthrow the Western civilization. That's the end goal. That's what it always was, and that's what it always will be. So, taking all of this knowledge into account, what we're currently seeing, or how we're currently seeing how Western politicians are dealing with the problem that is Iran, we must come to the conclusion that it plays right into their objectives and schemes. They've been allowed free rein to spread their proxy network across the region, unopposed. They've been given leniency by the international community. They've been appointed head of the United Nations Security Council, for crying out loud. They shook hands with Antonio Guterres, one of the most dangerous individuals currently walking the geopolitical landscape. So in order to mitigate the threat that is Iran, we have to mitigate their maneuvers. mitigate, sanction their proxy network, limit their movements, mitigate the threat that they pose, neutralize them whenever possible once they pose an active threat to our interests within the region and beyond. We have to understand that Iran doesn't want the same things that we in the West do. They don't want a prosperous Middle East, they don't want a secure Middle East. They want a Middle East that's under their whim. They want a Middle East where the Jewish state of Israel does not exist. They want a Middle East that's free from US and Western influence. They want a Middle East run by radical hardliners, overseen by them. That's the vision Iran has, not just for the Middle East, but for the entire world. This is all I want to share with you today. Thank you very much for listening to this clip. If you have any questions or comments for me, please feel free to leave them in the comment section below. If you wish to reach out to me or engage with me in some sort of discussion, please feel free to send me a message directly and I will get back to you as soon as possible. I ask of you to leave a like underneath this video, to subscribe to my channel GeoPod. I hope to disseminate more content to you in the future. Once again, I thank you for listening to this clip and have a blessed day.